The prospect of GE trees and the corporations that are pushing this technology it's really breathtaking. I mean, they're looking at 184 million acres of forests around the world. So their dream is to cut down all those forests and instead have these industrial, monocultured, essentially tree factories. No insects, no birds, no ecosystem, no life. These trees aren't really even trees. Any natural behavior of a tree is inhibited. So imagine that. That's their dream. That is where they're going to make their money. Down go all the forests, up come these tree factories, millions and millions of acres, these monocultures, whether they're going to be eucalyptus or poplar. That's their dream. That's going to be all these trees that they're then going to cut down and plant every couple of years for fuel.
They actually want to release 500 million genetically engineered trees all over the southeast for biomass burning every single year.
Recently, Congress set a goal for cellulosic biofuel production, 22 billion gallons. The USDA projects that the Southeast, with its natural diversity and its long growing season, will produce half of that total, nearly 11 billion gallons.
But the second biggest use for atrazine in the U.S. is in forestry. So when the trees are cut, my understanding is the atrazine is then applied aerially to prevent any weeds or competition from growing up while they replant the trees. Atrazine is the #1 contaminant of drinking water, surface water, rainwater, aquifers, groundwater, you name it, atrazine's in it. Atrazine's associated or correlated with a number of reproductive health problems in humans. So for example, it's associated with low sperm count, it's associated with an increase in breast cancer, it's associated with an increase in prostate cancer, it's associated with at least 3 birth defects.
And I think we've all probably experienced what happens when a poplar tree goes into cross-pollination. It's almost like a snow event. The pollen is so prolific and travels so far.
The pollen blowing on the wind that we breathe, certainly the inhalation route is just as powerful as consuming.
In 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine reviewed the animal feeding studies and said these animals are so sick and suffering, no one should be eating GMOs. They're suffering from gastrointestinal problems, immune problems, reproductive problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, and problems with cholesterol and insulin. So we've seen since then more evidence that GMOs are unsafe, both at the laboratory level, among livestock that are switched from GM to non-GM or vice versa, and we can see the differences in their health, and to humans who've stopped eating GMOs, and they and their physicians, by the thousands now prescribing non-GMO diets, describe health improvements. What's going to happen if they introduce plums or apples that are genetically engineered? It could affect every other plum and apple seller in the country and export markets.
We are contributing to the evolution of this story, applying biotechnology in the development of genetically modified trees, such as eucalyptus, aiming to enhance our company's competitiveness.
That means that if these companies are trying to engineer eucalyptus to have even more volatile oils, that could really raise some serious questions about what would happen if there were an adverse event like a fire. That might actually help spread the fire, because at least in California, some of those eucalyptus trees were I just like torches. When the fires would get high and were blowing through the Oakland hills, they would almost explode, and they helped exacerbate the whole problem of wildfires in California.
So when you burn wood, per unit of energy generation, you actually release more carbon into the atmosphere than you would if you were burning coal. The other thing is that burning wood for electricity produces a whole bunch of other pollutants, including particulates, very fine particulates like the ultrafine and nanoparticulates, which are very, very damaging to human health because they can bypass all of the protective mechanisms in the lungs and enter directly into bypass cell membranes and deliver straight into the bloodstream.
We're already seeing, massive plantations in places like Brazil, in those kind of tropical and subtropical climates down there. And they're a disaster. Any monoculture is going to be a disaster, and anything at the wrong scale is going to be a disaster. And so if you add GE trees to the kind of monoculture plantations that are already in existence down there, you just exacerbate a really bad problem, making it worse.
And now they come in with the GE trees to make things worse. The industrial tree monocultures are already very bad for communities. We have done 20 years of studies and talking with communities, and all the places communities complain that we didn't ask for these plantations and they have caused a lot of problems. They have removed many people, and now with the GE trees things will get worse because these trees are can come in more regions. If these trees are resistant to the herbicides, they can speed up the cycle. The cycle is like 5 years. For these biomass plantations, the cycle is 1 to 2 years. And they will plant more trees per hectare. For a pulpwood plantation, they plant between 1,500 and 2,000 trees. For a biomass plantation, they will plant up to 8,000 trees. And with the GE trees technology, they think they can more than duplicate the production.
The forests do not need agriculture. So it's not symbiotic, but agriculture needs the forests. So this idea of cutting down all the forests, getting rid of all those pollinators, all those insects, all those birds, all that life that we need to help us in our agriculture to create these monocultured industrial long lines of fertilized biofuel trees that are barely trees at all, it is not only disastrous for our situation with climate change and climate disruption, it's actually a disaster for our food security. And we at the Center for Food Safety, we care about food security.
So these are the kind of things we have to pay attention to long before we release anything that has genetically engineered pollen. Because once you release it, everyone in the environment, everyone in the area is going to be affected, especially those that are highly sensitive.
I used to work for the federal government. I was an attorney for the USDA. And I believe that the proper role of the government is to protect the public, to protect our health and safety, to protect the environment. And there are a lot of good people working for federal government in these agencies. But at the policy level, it's called regulatory capture. What's going on now at the federal government is that the private industry has been able to take over the regulatory system. And so government has basically abdicated its role in protecting the public health. Should the public be notified about something as incredibly serious as genetically engineered forests? Absolutely. I was doing some research on the loblolly pine, and that's one of the few trees. The reason I think they genetically engineered it is because they finally sequenced its entire DNA. And this pine tree has a genetic makeup that's 7 times more complex than human beings. So we have this organism that can grow 115 feet tall, and it can live and make seeds and spread pollen for 50 years, and it's part of a great forest environment where the birds eat the seeds. So there are 20, I think, different species of birds and small mammals for whom the loblolly pine seeds are their diet, not to mention all the other organisms that are involved in the soil and the roots and throughout the forest. We don't know how this organism is going to interact in the environment. We don't know how it's going to affect other animals, the roots and the soil, the water, other trees, or even ourselves. And the role of the federal government is supposed to be to protect ourselves, our health, our safety, the environment. And instead of doing that, they're allowing private companies to release these unstudied, unknown, and unpredictable organisms into the environment. My deepest value is the inherent integrity of the natural world, nature as it was given to us. And genetically modified organisms change all of that in ways that are unpredictable, and we just don't know what's going to happen in the long term to nature as it was given to us. So personally, I feel that the USDA, by allowing this private company to plant genetically modified tree plantations that spread their pollen for hundreds and maybe thousands of miles, that this is the equivalent of biological warfare.
My name is David Suzuki. I am, by training and profession, a geneticist. And for 25 years, I had an active career in science, once having the largest genetics lab in Canada. In discussions I've had with my fellow geneticists, they often say, listen, Suzuki, we're just talking about DNA. DNA is DNA. What difference does it make what organism it comes from? We pull it out of this organism, put it into another, it's just DNA. They forget a fundamental fact. We study the genetics of organisms by breeding a male and a female of one species, looking at their offspring and breeding them through what is called vertical inheritance within a species. When you take a gene from one species and transfer that DNA into a totally unrelated species, that's a completely different kind of experiment. This is now called horizontal inheritance. We've never done that before, and it is absolutely bad science to say that we can look at vertical inheritance and use the same ideas to explain what goes on in horizontal experiments. It's just lousy science.
You know, sometimes we forget, how do you get a wheat gene into a chestnut? I mean, how does that happen? What's that about, right? And here's how it happens. And this is not just true of chestnuts and many other things. You take the gene you want, the DNA that you want, you attach it to a vector, that is a bacteria, or a virus, because that's what, when we get sick, that's what invades our bodies, is a bacteria or a virus. So you take the gene, you attach it to this bacteria, and you put it in tissue culture, and it invades all the cells, and somewhere in that genome, in the DNA of that cell, it drops off the gene you want, somewhere in there. And they usually put little promoter viruses to make it work. So they call it a genetic cassette. You've got your bacteria, and you've attached your DNA, and you have little promoter viruses working in there. And that cassette goes into every nucleus of every cell of that tree. It's really invasion technology. You are invading that cell with novel DNA that it has never seen before. The cell usually resists it, so you put in your viral promoters to promote that new protein that you've put in there to make the invasion successful. And that goes into every cell of that tree. 99.9999% of these don't work. They fail, whether it be a tomato or a eucalyptus tree or anything else, or a chestnut tree. They fail. And then every once in a while, they finally find one thing that looks like it has the property they want. But this is the most imprecise technology imaginable. They don't know exactly where it's going to go. They don't know exactly what it's going to do. They just keep doing it over and over again, this cell invasion, until they get a trait that looks something like what they want, and they call that a success. But they have no idea of the systemic impacts of that. They have no idea what else it's doing in that genome. They have no idea what it's doing with the other DNA and the zillions of other parts of the cell that are working to develop that organism and that will then pass that on to future generations. They have no idea. So when they tell you this is a precise technology, that is scientific nonsense. And it's not only scientific nonsense, it's dangerous scientific nonsense to think that way.
What actually was found out that the process of genetic engineering itself causes hundreds to thousands of mutations. That means we have changed more than just putting that trait in. What has been changed additional to that is not being assessed, whether it is a problem, whether it is a risk, and what the consequences are.
So it's made in a laboratory, and more often than not, they're inserting viruses or bacteria into these plants.
Why do they do that?
They do that because GMOs were designed to sell more chemicals.
When papaya was introduced to Hawaii, Japan shut its doors. The cost of papaya, the selling price, went from $1.29 per kilo to about 80 cents below the cost of production. There was a 40% shrinkage in the papaya industry in Hawaii at the same time that there was an increase in papaya consumption on the mainland. So it actually destroyed the economics of the industry.
Because I know the first engineered trees that were planted a lot in China, this Bt poplar, that means that these cry proteins that could be in the pollen could be being inhaled by people, and there are potential health risks of that.
Introducing genetically engineered trees is kind of like looking at tree plantations on steroids, where you're going to be able to accelerate the turnover. It's going to take more pesticides, more herbicides, much more intensive management.
In the Philippines, there was a village right next to a Bt cornfield. And they woke up one day and there was a terrible stench from the cornfield, and one person was volunteered to go in and see what was going on. By the time he got to the middle of the cornfield, his face had swollen up and he could hardly breathe. And it took him a long time to recover. People started getting sick. Those who were living right next to the cornfield, and within a few days it spread to the rest of the village. Most of the village got sick, and people moved away, they got better. When they moved back, they got sick. A team came in to investigate. They found that the production of the Bt toxin, even on one corn cob, varied by 99-fold from one kernel to another, so maybe there was some genetic instability, maybe there was some unique problem with that. We don't know, because as most GMO research happens, it's thwarted. There's efforts to suppress it. But the same corn was planted in 4 more villages and similar problems happened. There was respiratory problems, flu-like symptoms. There was also unexplained deaths in humans and animals of those that ate the corn. And it was a lot of report on that in the news, but no real official investigation.
I think it's far less than 1% of what's actually sprayed hits the intended target, and the rest of that is just off in environments. So aerial spraying, that's more of a risk for any farmers that are in the area or farm workers.
ISIS. It's simultaneously cool sounding and stands for pure evil, like Monsanto. Monsanto, who we recently learned puts an ingredient in Roundup, their ubiquitous crop spray, called polyethoxylated toluamine, that is far more toxic than anyone realized. Folks, ISIS isn't going to kill you. Things like polyethoxylated toluamine, that's what's going to kill you.
Communities that live near these big biomass facilities are very, very concerned and mostly fighting these facilities on the basis of their concern about air pollution and their health.
Here is the crops in the field, in the soil, in the wind, in the waste products when they dump it. I don't know where they dump it. Going into the workers, community workers, going into the children, the school next door, on the wind. Oh, here it is coming into your food. Are we testing it? I'm not sure. To me, not good enough, and we eat it. Wow. American Academy of Environmental Medicine. Who are these guys? About 300 PhD MDs, Canadian and American. They make a statement in 2009, and essentially they say that physicians now, environmental medicine, they want physicians to warn their patients, we do not know the risk of GM food. Yes.
So here are the facts as we know them. 70 to 80% of foods we eat today contain GMOs. There's 1.1 billion pounds of pesticides a year that are used on these crops, in part because they are GMO and they're made to be able to survive this.
Dr. Oz, for a long time I didn't know that pesticides might be affecting my children. In fact, they had rashes and severe allergies for years. But then I learned that not only are GMOs sprayed with pesticides, but non-GMO foods are as well. And I learned that glyphosate kills gut bacteria. And I instinctively knew that that had to have something to do with my children's health issues. So we went not only GMO free, but organic to avoid pesticides, and my children's health got better.
Atrazine can travel over 1,000 miles. So atrazine goes up on dust, it travels in the clouds, it comes down in the rainwater and the snow. It's been shown in Europe and in the US that can travel at least 1,000 miles. 500,000 pounds of atrazine reportedly come down in the rainwater in the United States every year. So the aerial spraying of atrazine, as far as I know, is only used for forestry.
I really fear that releasing G.E.trees on any part of this planet is going to contaminate native forests. You know, it's inevitable that this will happen if we release those trees, and so we simply have to stop them. You know, I stand for a moratorium on GE trees, plain and simple. You know, even with just trial patches, you know, you can get a genetic spread from these things. And we don't want to play God with nature. You know, that is not the role of human beings. We need to recognize that we are embedded in a natural system that's evolved over 5 billion years, right? And we need to be humble and recognize that we're just a strand in the web of life, right? The real assignment for us is to get human civilization to be in sync with the basic principles of ecology and the laws of nature. That's what we need. And in some cases they'll say, well, genetically engineered trees are better carbon scrubbers. You know, it's just all such bullshit, plain and simple. You know, let's just be very clear about this. You know, a plantation, first of all, is not a forest. The carbon calculations are such that plantations don't hold as much carbon as a natural forest. And even if they did, which they don't, you lose so many other things when you eradicate a natural forest. You lose that entire web of life of relationships of plants and animals and species and insects, you know, most of which have not even been studied. All kinds of medicinal properties are driven into extinction. Potential cures for cancer and so many other things are gone. The local communities are going to suffer from these kinds of replacement of natural forests for genetically engineered monocultures and plantations. It's not going to produce the jobs. They're going to use mechanization to the hilt. The exports are going to be ripped out of the, or what's going to be exported out of the community really is the cultural integrity of those small towns and rural communities. The soil fertility itself will be stripped out through the process. The water systems locally are likely to be contaminated with pesticides and herbicides and who knows what, as well as the contamination of the natural environment around these monocultures through the gene pool, you know, spreading with these artificially constructed Franken trees.
But just imagine you have a tree that, and other trees, and that is then a plantation, and that has no seeds, no pollen, nothing that actually is food for the insects, for the birds, for anything else. So from a biologist's point of view, it's a sterile plot of plants that is not willing to share anything. No giving, no taking with other organisms. It's completely isolated within the ecosystem.
So let's not call genetically engineered tree plantations forests, okay? Let's call them green deserts. Again, we have to be really clear about what we're talking about. There's no life there. It's just a factory. It's just an industry. And with all of its pollution and all of its problems, social problems. We have to put the culture back into agriculture. Because if you take the culture out of agriculture, all you've got is agribusiness. And that's what you have with your genetically engineered trees.
The problems with these plantations for local communities, in the first place, they don't know about these plantations when the trees are being planted. They are not involved at all. They are not consulted. They are not asked to give their consent to these plantations. These are top-down plans. So communities often they are taken by surprise. They are being removed from their lands before they can take action. Once the plantation is there, then other problems arise because the companies, they often cause deforestation, which is another impact. So if the community can stay, they lose their forest areas. And the forest areas are extremely important to collect all kinds of food, to hunt, to fish. Especially the women are affected because they have often the most strongest relation with the forest.
La tierra está seca. No se puede producir agricultura.
The land is dry. We cannot do agriculture and we cannot raise animals because of the lack of water. There are people who produce honey and they sell it, but they encounter problems because of lack of water and pesticides.
Digamos, viable, bueno para la gente. Porque la miel se puede vender.
Because of the aerial spraying and spraying by hand to have healthy trees, the birds are harmed, the bees are harmed, and they die.
Que para mantener los árboles que crezcan rápido, se contaminan los pájaros, se contamina, las abejitas se mueren. Y la gente que tiene...
The people with small projects end up with nothing.
Quedan así, no pueden seguir.
So, and without the forest and planting these plantations, especially eucalyptus plantations, they consume a lot of water. They grow extremely fast. In Brazil, for example, in about 5-6 years they are 30 meters high. Brazil eucalyptus has a productivity of 45 cubic meters per hectare per year, compared with 4 in Finland or 6 in Sweden. So it's extremely fast growing, large, and it's being large scale planted, so it's a huge consumption of water. So the water sources of the communities, if they are able to stay, if they can stay in their community, they have no water anymore. And the water that is still left is being contaminated by the use by herbicides and other pesticides, but especially herbicides. Glyphosate is used especially in the first years of the plantations because they only wanted trees. But these large-scale plantations, they are only planted for export. All what is being produced is taken away. And the few people who work there, it's very dangerous work. It's very bad working conditions. Often it's about applying the pesticides, so they are getting contaminated. Even if they use the protective equipment, nothing protects against 8 or more hours per day being in touch with pesticides, applying pesticides, smelling the wind filled with pesticides.
So if we do away with all of the understory growth, the beautiful flowers, the shrubs, the other tree species, and start to produce a monoculture in our forest, like the agricultural ecosystem, monoculture of one type of plant, Lord knows what it is that we might be throwing away and losing for evolutionary purposes, for practical purposes, and environmental purposes. We just don't know what we might be throwing away in creating a forest ecosystem that's monoculture.
A lot of our medicine people and our elders are very concerned about this, is that this type of technology of genetically engineered trees is not a solution at all, and that whether we're utilizing GE type of trees or natural native trees for tree farming, that's not a solution either. When we look at genetically engineered trees, a lot of our people say there's really no life to that tree. There's no spirit to that tree. It's already been corrupted. It affects on whether we even, use parts of that tree. How can that sustain that vital life cycle of Mother Earth itself? And that's our message that we're trying to give as indigenous peoples.
Las plantaciones.
The plantations in reality are the worst thing that have come to our land. It is an illness to nature, and the land is crying. And if the land is crying, the people cry and the children cry.
Y si la tierra llora, su gente lloran, sus niños lloran.
We submitted almost 40,000 public comments, so almost 10,000 to 1 people were commenting against the genetically engineered tree plantations. So the campaign has grown internationally and currently includes over 200 organizations in 49 countries all over the world who have united together to call for a global ban on the release of all genetically engineered trees into the environment.
And of course the apple industry, organic and non-organic, are alarmed at this whole technology because they know that this is going to be a public relations disaster, and so we got to boycott the Arctic apple if the government approves it, and point out at the same time that organic apples are the only apples that you should be feeding yourself or your kids. The other ones are doused with so many chemicals already that it's unbelievable. We need the tree huggers and the foodies and the people, the climate hawks, to close ranks and work together. And genetically engineered trees they're an excellent issue because they should bring in the alternative food and farming movement, which has grown quite sizable, together with the forest conservation movement and the ocean, movements and so on.
But it was those kitchen table conversations that really changed people. So I'm encouraging people to be very well informed as much as they can, but eventually to just go into what they really care about and talk to each other one-on-one, to other human beings, people who disagree or are uninformed, and talk about what really matters as human beings. For me, as a grandmother, as somebody who wants to have healthy food. There's so much common ground that we can come from. So I think if we're dependent on any kind of corporate form for food or information, it's not going to be a good idea. And people naturally gravitate to that one-on-one, small group, human. It's in our DNA to tell stories, to talk about each other, and to find common ground, find out what we really care about. And if we can build a movement based on that, I think that we'll be able to make more progress.
Organic papaya growers on the Big Island of Hawaii have lost their certification because of contamination from the genetically engineered plants.
In my opinion, we have not studied these things carefully enough before release, especially to the open field. And after today's finding about how widespread these things are, it just raises my concern that much more. When we make a mistake medically, we recall the product. Can you recall this? Thank you.
But in a victory for food safety advocates, Hawaii's Maui County passed one of the strongest anti-GMO measures ever, despite the opposition outspending supporters by a ratio of 87-1. The Maui GMO moratorium calls for a complete suspension of the cultivation of GMO crops until studies conclusively prove they are safe. The studies will be paid for by the seed companies but administered by the county.
For more, we go to Maui, where we're joined by Dr. Lauren Pang. He served as a consultant to the World Health Organization and works for Maui's Department of Health. As a private citizen, Dr. Pang has raised concerns about the possible health and environmental risks posed by GMOs. He helped draft and submit Maui's successful GMO moratorium and initiative.
We had a major victory about 5 years ago legislatively on the county level. The Big Island County and Maui, we blocked the genetic modification of taro, which is important culturally to the Hawaiians, in the laboratory, in the markets, and in the fields. This issue has moved very well over the last 12 years. 12 years ago, I could name on two hands all the people in the state who knew what GMO, genetically modified organisms, stood for. Now we have thousands of people, so it really has been a grassroots education effort.